The role of autoantibodies is well known in many of the autoimmune connective tissue disorders. But what is happening is that how significant or how important are these autoantibodies in other conditions, other than immunological conditions, is something in many areas where it is still very underutilized, not much of use, and how we can just look at them. I'll just brief a little on all those things. This is not a completely exhaustive list, and neither is it that what I'm going to talk is going to be complete, because each one is in a topic on its own. So I'll just touch briefly on a few of those things. The first autoantibody which was detected in a lab was the anti-nuclear antibody by basically it was Hargreaves et al. Who saw this in 1948, who saw this phenomenon what is called as the Ellis-Cell phenomenon in the bone marrow of the patients with lupus. And they thought that it was realized as an autoantibody, but then they realized that it was not such a very sensitive assay. And then from 1950s, that the indirect immunofluorescence technique for anti-nuclear antibody which came into existence is they realized were more sensitive and more specific, more sensitive rather. But what has happened at the same time, a lot of investigations were being done on the various autoantibodies, and a huge array of autoantibodies started coming. And the first commercial kit which came in was only in the 80s. That is just about 25 to 30 years back. It's not too long ago that these autoantibodies were really being used in the diagnostic setup. Just about 25 to 3 decades, and now already we have come a long way from where we have started. The various methods for detection, I'm not going to get into the details, are enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, the ELISA, the indirect immunofluorescence assays, radioimmunoassays, and now multiplexing is possible with live immunoassays, immunoblot assays, and even laser-based techniques such as which use again the fluorescence principles such as flow cytometry. We cannot start off with autoantibodies without ANA, so I'll just go in. They have already been discussed in detail in the morning on the immunological conditions. What I would like to say is ANA doesn't mean that it is SLE, and it is multiple connective tissue disorders, and immunofluorescence still stands as the gold standard as far as ANA is concerned, because you can identify the various patterns in it, which gives us a clue as to what possible autoantibody, what could be the target antigen, and thus the associated condition. So this is just to show a homogeneous pattern, the nucleolar pattern, rim pattern, and speckle pattern. I won't go into much into this. The diseases where ANA is very useful in diagnosis, of course, is SLE, systemic sclerosis, inflammatory myositis, Sjogren's syndrome. And there are few conditions. If an ANA is positive, then only you can consider it as you can diagnose that condition. And these few ones are drug-induced lupus erythematosus, autoimmune hepatitis, and mixed connective tissue disorders, which are conditions where ANA is intrinsic to the diagnostic criteria. In addition, ANA has a role in monitoring only in cases of juvenile chronic rheumatoid arthritis who have associated uveitis and Raynaud's phenomenon. But most of the time, ANA is positive in many other conditions, many other connective tissue disorders, other chronic infections, lymphomas, and so on, and even in normal patients. So these are the conditions where ANA is being done very commonly, like rheumatoid arthritis, ITP, and all. But in all these conditions, the ANA is not useful for diagnosis, and it should not be used as an initial screening assay. The connective tissue disorders where it is positive has already been discussed on. It's just a small flow to show how you can work up whenever you do an ANA by immunofluorescence assay. If it is negative, you should still, if you are strongly suspecting, then you should still go in to do other investigations like anti-Jo1 and anti-Ro, which may sometimes be negative in the case of, say, polymyositis or dermatomyositis, because they are not positive in all cases. The fluorescence positivity is there. Patient has skin involvement, joint involvement, do for other ANA profiling, other antibodies such as dsDNA, SM-Ro, which will give a clue to SLE. If there is a history of exposure to drugs, look for it. If there is presence of anti-histone antibodies, indicates drug-induced lupus. If patient, in addition to the ANA positivity, gives a history of dry eyes, dry mouth, think in terms of Sjogren's syndrome, and look for anti-Ro, anti-Da antibodies. And if any other features are present, such as Raynaud's phenomenon, sclerodectiny, and all those, a profile in hepatic features, and if anti-SCO70 usually indicates the scleroderma, usually the disseminated form, the anti-centromere antibody, the limited form of scleroderma, mixed connective tissue disorder, where it will have a UN RNP positive and the titer should be more than 1000, and antijovan as in polymyositis. The other important investigation which is important in very vasculitis like picture is ANCA, that is anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibody. These antibodies are seen, this is a slide which shows the 4 Biogen. The first one, these are the ethanol fixed slides, which it shows here, it shows the P-ANCA protein. The liver tissue, if it is ANCA, will show just in between positivity, but otherwise if it had been AA positive, the liver tissue would have shown multiple mode nucleation positivity. The formalin fixed slides to differentiate whether it is ethanol formalin resistant or it is sensitive, and this is the Hep2 cells where it is negative because it's a not AA positive sample. There are various target antigens in all these patterns. To brief here, if it is a C-ANCA pattern, then the thing which you more likely think of is proteinase 3 antibody, probably in vaginal granulomatosis, it's more specific. It can sometimes be seen in other forms of vasculitis. MPO myeloperoxidase staining will show, usually this is a P-ANCA pattern, could be because of myeloperoxidase or other enzymes such as elastase, lactoferrin, cathepsin, which can again be positive in microscopic polyangiitis, vaginal granulomatosis, Sturge syndrome, and so on. And this is the atypical ANCA pattern, which could again give, there are so many antigens associated, and these are usually positive in inflammatory bowel disease, autoimmune rheumatic diseases, and some forms of vasculitis. So if an ANCA is positivity, it helps also in the diagnosis and also in the monitoring of the therapy in the case of, because it's not always possible to get a biopsy diagnosis. Now coming to the other areas, which that is other than rheumatology, we'll just look at autoantibodies in gastroenterology. These are useful, these are all autoimmune conditions, the atrophic gastritis, primary biliary cirrhosis, autoimmune hepatitis, inflammatory bowel disease to differentiate the Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, celiac disease, and the query is basically because these antibodies are basically gluten induced and are not really autoantibodies, and autoimmune pancreatitis. Coming to primary biliary cirrhosis, which is a very common condition, gives an ANA positivity in these patients. Usually what we see in an ANA when we do is not just the nuclear state, but the cytoplasmic state of the Hep2 cells, so which makes us think along those lines. So anti-mitochondrial is something which you need to look into. And anti-mitochondrial antibody, specifically the type 2 of the 9 types, is very specific for primary biliary cirrhosis. And more than that, then with very high specificity is the anti-SP100. This particular autoantibody is more specific in the anti-mitochondrial antibody negative cases. So the prevalence of it varies from 31% in a AMA positive patient to 48% in an AMA negative. It has a high specificity and hence considered as a marker of primary biliary cirrhosis. The other autoantibodies are PML and GP210. Let us look at autoimmune hepatitis. It has a very major role here. An unresolved inflammation of the liver of unknown cause, characterized by the presence of interface hepatitis. Patient has in addition hypergammaglobulinemia and autoantibodies, plus central lobular necrosis on biopsy. Then you can label this patient as autoimmune hepatitis. But before that, what we have to do is we have to rule out other causes like Wilson's disease, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiencies, viral hepatitis, hemochromatosis, drug-induced, and non-alcoholic, and in addition, the cholangiopathies. So it was the autoimmune hepatitis group which set a few criteria for the diagnosis of autoimmune hepatitis, which say that you have to rule out all these causes which I have mentioned, and then you should, in addition, you should have an increase in the gamma globulin level and the presence of the autoantibodies with interface hepatitis on the biopsy. The autoantibodies in autoimmune hepatitis are anti-nuclear antibodies, smooth muscle antibodies, antibodies to LKM, and P-ANCA. This is just to show the actin positivity which is seen, because smooth muscle antibodies are positive in the autoimmune hepatitis. This is a Hep2 cells which shows the filamentous positive cytoplasmic stain, and then these are all biochips where you can use multiple substrates at the same time so that you can rule out one antibody or reconfirm, so which is done again in immunofluorescence. This actin will show positivity for bile-calanicular state, and it will show the smooth muscle staining of the rat liver and the stomach and private heart vessels. LKM is another antibody which is very important, particularly in the type 2 autoimmune hepatitis. And these are the autoimmune hepatitis associated with extrahepatic syndromes such as arthralgias, vitiligo, glomerulonephritis, and chronic inflammatory bowel disease. Before we do it again, it has to be differentiated from viral hepatitis. LKM will show a nice mitochondrial staining of the liver cells, as well as it will stain only the proximal convoluted tubules in the rat kidney. The other antibodies which are there is anti-SLA antibodies, that is soluble liver antigens, chromatins, acytoglycoproteins, and liver cytosol. These are usually associated with severe disease and thus have a prognostic significance. Then it's just a simplified flow chart how to go about diagnosing an autoimmune hepatitis. Whenever there is an increase in the liver enzymes and alkaline phosphatase is more than 3 times, the antimitochondrial antibody is negative, so that we rule out primary biliary cirrhosis. All the symptoms are ruled out. Patient has a biopsy shows interface hepatitis or lobular hepatitis. If the gamma globulin level is more than 1.5, that of the normal levels, and any of these autoantibodies are positive in more than 1 in 80 dilution, no exposure to drugs, alcohol intake is not there, it is definitely autoimmune hepatitis. If the autoantibody levels are not very high and gamma globulin is raised but not very much, not between 1 to 1.5 times the normal, then you can say it is probable. But again, after this, these antibodies, the ones in type 1 autoimmune hepatitis, ANA and SMA are positive, that is for active, and in type 2 hepatitis, the LKM is positive. The International Autoimmune Hepatitis Group report, it shows the scoring which is done for autoimmune hepatitis. It is definite. These are all the criteria which we have discussed, which will be taken into consideration. It is definite if the score is more than 15, and 10 to 15, that means it's probably autoimmune hepatitis. And if the patient is already on therapy, then the score, we have to put in a higher score. If it's more than 17, it is definitely positive, and probably autoimmune if it is between 12 to 17. The next one is the inflammatory bowel disease. Inflammatory bowel disease, the autoantibodies which are being done here is one condition where patient presents with recurrent diarrhea, recurrent thing. We have to get a biopsy for this patient, and sometimes it is not always feasible to get a biopsy in these cases, or even if we take a biopsy, we may not get a representative lesion. Even on histopathology, sometimes it becomes so very difficult to differentiate a Crohn's disease from an ulcerative colitis. So in these kind of cases, the autoantibodies have a great role, and the autoantibodies which have been tried, but I find that there is a lot of resistance from gastroenterologists to consider this or to get into their thing to do these investigations, because they feel that it's not yet proven. But anyway, we still, yes, probably there are non-specific positive stainings also, but then it definitely helps in those cases where it becomes very critical and we are unable to decide. The autoantibodies which are done in chronic inflammatory bowel diseases are the goblet cell antibodies and the BANCA, antibodies against exocrine pancreas, and the Mannose group of the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is an organism. And in one of the studies, it was found that this is the prevalence of anti-Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and they have shown a very high specificity, specifically for the Crohn's disease and sensitivity and specificity. Not very high probably. What I mean to say is in comparison to UC, they show much more significance in Crohn's disease. These are the serological markers. In ulcerative colitis, goblet cell antibodies and PANCA are positive. And in Crohn's disease, the antibodies against exocrine pancreas and Saccharomyces cerevisiae are positive. If you see, we can do both IgA and IgG assays on that, and the diagnostic hit rate increases if you are doing both IgA and IgG are possible. We do have these kind of chips where if you want to say a CIBD profile, we are doing that, where you can ask for a chronic inflammatory bowel disease profile, and we can do all these 4 investigations together on one slide, so it becomes easy and cost effective for the patient. CIBD profile is a non-invasive procedure. We requires only a serum sample, very useful in condition where access to representative tissue is difficult. The American College of Gastroenterologists, they state that while Priyanka and Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibodies assessed at this stage of knowledge are neither a first step nor a definitive step in differential diagnosis or clinical decision making. They may be useful in the patients in whom all other clinical features do not allow a distinction between a UC and a Crohn's. So as I said, it becomes more useful in those difficult cases. I am not saying that they would be probably the first line of investigation, but in very difficult cases, like and sometimes in children, it definitely becomes a very useful thing. But it should not be used in isolation. You have to have strong clinical suspicion, because the moment you start doing like a battery for all other patients, we will find more and more non-specific assays, and then the significance of that particular assay is completely lost. Studies indicate that it may predict development of CIBD years before the disease is clinically diagnosed in cases of family clustering. And suppose a patient has been diagnosed of either ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, it may sometimes be useful, probably in the long run, that we should be able to screen the relatives if necessary for this specific antibody. But still, it is not yet proven as such in that cases. Atrophic glyceritis, the H. pylori serology will help and assess along with it the other antibodies such as parietal cell antibodies, intrinsic factor antibodies, I think it's not mentioned here, luminal antibodies and canalicular antibodies will help in the diagnosis of atrophic gastritis, provided of course, as I said, they will have vitamin B12 deficiency or chloride. The thing which is hit is actually the hydrogen potassium pump. So we can differentiate parietal cells will take a nice staining in the immunofluorescence, and we have to however differentiate it from anti-mitochondrial. So antibodies which can sometimes also stain the parietal cells. So we do one thing called as a urea treatment so that it doesn't get affected by urea treatment, whereas the mitochondrial antibodies do get affected by the urea treatment. Another condition where autoantibodies really become very significant is the polymyositis, dermatomyositis group. These myositis-specific antibodies are useful not just in diagnosis, but also in therapeutic decision, when to start therapy, stop therapy, and how I just tell you that anti-B2 is highly specific for dermatomyositis, found in 15 to 30% of cases, and if it is present, it usually indicates a good prognosis. PMSCL is positive in 50 to 70% of cases where there is an overlap with systemic sclerosis. Presence of a Jovan antibody indicates that the prognosis is not very good because the patient is likely to have interstitial lung fibrosis, and similarly the PL7. So now we have these kind of assays. These are immunoblot assays where you do in a single immunoblot assay to see for the presence of all the autoantibodies when you're suspecting a myositis or a dermatomyositis, which might help us for the patient's decision making. As far as dermatology is concerned, the differentiation of bullous skin lesions is based on this immunofluorescence assays itself. Many of these bullous lesions are diagnosed basically on this. What is important is the clinical appearance, the histopathology, and the direct immunofluorescence assay, wherein the immunofluorescence is done on the skin biopsy of the affected patient. And what we look at actually is the IgG, IgA-M, and C3 in all these cases. And this is the one which helps us in differentiating the various pemphigus or pemphigoid group of lesions, that is the bullous lesions. But now even the serum antibodies are gaining significance because they are useful in understanding the pathogenesis of the disease, and they are being done by most of the time by enzyme assays. The intraepidermal desmosomes or antibodies are the ones which are associated with pemphigus, whereas the bullous pemphigoid-like lesions, it is the Basement membrane zone antibodies which are usually present. This is just a direct type, indirect type. I won't get into the details, I know it gets too much. For the renal conditions where it is useful is, we all know that immunopathogenesis is a major cause of all this. Immunopathogenesis is the one which is involved in the renal injury actually which occurs, and in glomerulonephritis particularly, and sometimes in the tubules. These can occur as an effect of direct damage to the glomerular basement membrane, as in Goodpasture syndrome, while the deposition of immune complexes such as complements and immune complexes in other glomerulonephritis, induction of vasculitis and clotting such as in henoch-Schönlein-Coppola, or because of some renal failure by deposition light chains in tubules. Of this, the Goodpasture syndrome, glomerular basement membrane antibodies They sometimes are useful in monitoring also besides in the diagnosis. So even autoantibody assays are being done in serum for Goodpasture syndrome, that is the anti-glomerular basement membrane antibodies. They may coexist with ANCA and with other rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis. This is the direct tie-up on biopsy to show the findings of all of these, like in skin we do here to differentiate the different groups of renal tissue. Other than the histopathology, it will help us in the diagnosis. But coming to the serum autoantibodies, we have to do, in addition to glomerular basement membrane antibodies, both ANCA as well as dsDNA, because we need to differentiate the other features. They all have similar clinical features like lupus, vaginous, microvascular polyarteritis, IgA, they all present similar clinical features. So it is even necessary to do other autoantibodies like dsDNA and ANCA to help in the differentiation. In GBM, only anti-GBM antibodies are present. In SLE, dsDNA, vaginous, we have ANCA positivity. Microvascular polyarteritis, we again have ANCA positivity. And IgA nephropathy will be negative in all these cases. There are various neuromuscular conditions which are positive, as I have already discussed on myositis. Other than that, there are so many other conditions like myasthenia gravis, Stickman syndrome, which are associated with diabetes as in GAD, or with paraneoplastic syndrome such as the anti-fibrin antibodies. The antibody range is quite wide. In myasthenia gravis, the acetylcholine receptor antibodies is associated in 80% of patients, and antibodies in peripheral neuropathy are usually the GM1 diamyloxide antibody and myelin-associated lipoproteins. But now a lot of interest is coming when what is called as the paraneoplastic syndromes, which present with neurological manifestations. And these antibodies are the ones which have been classified as enteric neuronal antibodies, which are usually associated with small cell carcinoma of the lung. The neuronal nuclear antibodies, which are associated with small cell carcinoma of the lung and the carcinoma of the breast. The Purkinje cell antibodies, which are associated with ovarian tumors and Hodgkin's lymphoma. And the retinal antibodies such as small cell carcinomas. There was a multi-center trial which was being done, and in that it was noted that the presence of the WHO antibody, which is one of the antibodies associated with paraneoplastic syndrome in patients with small cell carcinoma. But these patients who didn't have neurological features, it indicated relatively limited disease and long survival. So there are thoughts which say that probably anti-WHO and immune complex is protective in all these patients. So since there was a lot of confusion regarding the role of anti-neuronal antibodies, it was possible to set out a few guidelines to say which are the antibodies which are significant in these neuronal conditions. So according to him, the relevance of anti-neuronal nuclear antibodies, a particular antibody must be present in more than one patient with similar neurological disorder and corresponding tumor but with low false positives and negatives. Because what happened, everyone started seeing that this particular antibody is important in this condition. Just do a study of 2 cases and then come up saying this antibody is important. So they started setting up this kind of guidelines. The concentration of the antibody should be high, and a higher titer in CSF than serum suggests intrathecal synthesis and probably involvement in the neurological disorders. And antibody should react to the symptomatic part of the nervous system, and the nature of the antigen must be identified by both immunohistochemistry and Western blot, and only doing just IF or ELISA is not going to be enough. So these are the very common antibodies which are usually associated with paraneoplastic syndrome, that is the anti-Yo, anti-WHO and anti-V antibodies. These are the immunohistochemistry findings, Western blot assays and all that. And the same thing. So as I said, in neurology there has really been a lot of autoantibodies which have come up. The antibodies are wide, and if I just get into all that list, it will be a session of 2 hours on its own as independently. So we do use, but one thing where we use autoantibodies more frequently is in endocrine conditions such as Hashimoto's thyroiditis, Graves' disease, diabetes mellitus. It's not used, autoantibodies are not really used, but yes, in thyroid diseases we are using autoantibodies. For that matter, the diagnosis of autoimmune thyroiditis is dependent on the presence of these autoantibodies. We call them as autoimmune thyroid antibodies only after the present risk. In diabetes, the antibodies which are usually associated are the GAD antibodies, which is the glutamic acid decarboxylase 65 antibody, anti-insulin antibodies, islet cell antibodies, insulin-associated antibodies, insulin receptor antibodies. The thing is that what has been found what is the significance is that the presence of 2 or more of the following type is associated with a high incidence of type 1 diabetes within 5 to 7 years. The glutamic acid, islet cells, insulin. They have done a lot of studies to see how early they appear and how many years after the appearance of these antibodies do the type 1 diabetes manifest. So it has been noted that the titers of both islet cell antibodies and insulin antibodies eliminate once beta cell destruction is advanced and are not usually detected in the first year of life. So they are more commonly present in the first half, the beginning of the disease and before the disease has become manifest, etc. The islet cell antibody in the study says that prevalence or diagnosis is 75%, just a diagnosis first stage, first degree relatives 2 to 5%, so in general population 0.4%. May be significant, maybe not. You just have to go about it. But the thing is, it is detected years before clinical manifestation. And it enables early identification of persons at increased risk. The positive predictive values in various relatives, when you did 1 antibody, 2 antibodies and 3 antibodies is like this. In one study it said 2%, 25% and 75%. Whereas in another study it said 15%, 44% and 100%. That means most of these patients who were positive had developed type 1 diabetes. So if that becomes true, then probably we might be able to predict if a baby, that means because with these early diabetes, the type 1 diabetes usually present much early in life. So you'll have to look for these antibodies very, very early in the life for these patients to know that yes, they may develop and maybe if possible, we might be able to get it for early intervention and avoid disease. But still, there's a very long way to go for us. The thyroid antibodies, as I said, this is one area where everyone does use, is the antithyroid antibodies. These are usually the thyroglobulin, thyrotropin receptor antibodies. These are basically for differentiating the diagnosis of Graves' disease but not distinguish between stimulatory or inhibitory, and TPO. The TP antibodies are also called as the microsomal antibodies. The thyroglobulin and the anti-TPO bodies combined can detect almost all Goiter's thyroiditis, that is Hashimoto's thyroiditis, atrophic thyroiditis, and about 70 to 90% of Graves' disease because of autoimmune causes. So the role of autoantibodies is like wide. Just about, as I said, it was just 2 or 3 decades back that the first autoantibody was detected for diagnostic use. They started using the kit, not really, probably it was detected at the turn of the century, but what I mean is that it started getting into the commercial kits which were available for just 2 or 3 decades ago, and we have come a very long way. Autoantibodies, they serve as markers to define and classify disease. For example, in thyroid diseases, you say it is autoimmune or not, just based on the presence of these autoantibodies. They serve as markers of disease activity and severity, because many of them correlate, high titers correlate with increased disease severity, such as in the anti-GBM antibodies in Goodpaster syndrome. And they serve as markers to predict disease, probably because, as I said, in thyroid and in diabetes, as well as celiac disease, not celiac, yes, but if these antibodies could be detected much earlier and we could be able to predict the possibility of a disease occurring. These are just There are a few antibody profiles that we are doing. I just thought I'll mention what is being done in our lab. We are doing the anti-nuclear antibodies, the ANCA, the C-ANCA and the P-ANCA. We are doing the LKM, that is the liver kidney microsomal antibodies, anti-mitochondrial antibodies, anti-smooth muscle antibodies, all of which are useful in autoimmune hepatitis and primary biliary cirrhosis. The CIBD profile, that is to differentiate between ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. dsDNA we have been using for long actually. Anti-cardiolipin antibodies in association with lupus anticoagulants for detection of antiphospholipid syndromes. Anti-thyroid antibodies, ANA profile, which has a huge wide group of antibodies, about 15 antibodies, Rola, nucleosome antibodies, DO1 antibodies, UNR involved. And the myositis profile also we have used. And probably we should be able to introduce a few more antibodies, of course, provided they are proven that they are useful in the diagnosis. A few research work is also going along those lines. And what makes it possible is this group of people who help us, who always work together, and they give us all the enthusiasm, and they never feel, oh, one more antibody introduced, one more thing introduced, a little more work, but they always take part with all our activities. Is the group at Chandra Diagnostics. Thank you so much.
And we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Renuka, do we have time for a few questions? Yeah. 1 or 2. Yeah, one or two questions, probably. Yeah, may I ask the first question? ANA by ELISA, is it worthwhile doing?
I wouldn't say there is no other assay which is being done. See, definitely ANA by IF is a much better method to do, though there are now few studies which are saying ELISA is better basically because of the ease. The ease because in immunofluorescence you need expertise and it is a long drawn out procedure. So many of them are trying to prove that ELISA is going to be a better assay so that they can automate it and just forget about it. But may not be actually. Any day IF is a much better method than to do by ELISA. But if there is no other possible, like suppose you are in a setup which is not in a city and you are much more further available and ELISA is the only possibility thing, then maybe it can be done.
Community screening also is better.
Community screening, yes.
Thank you. Any
But
questions?
community screening, when we have so much of a false positives, is it worthwhile to do as a ANA as a test? I don't
In the
know.
first go clinical.
Go clinical examination. Yes.
Any questions from the audience? Well, if there are no questions, either you have clarified everything or confused them. Thank you.
Probably. That's not the
Thank you.
Thank you.